Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. This is a recording of Rabbi Adam Kligfeld's weekly Rashi study class.
And hello to anyone who's listening asynchronously via the Temple Beth Am podcast. Great to be back studying with you. Okay, I should have a book. We are in the middle of a Rashi. We stopped in the middle of a Rashi the last time we were here. I know last week. Where are you are you still in Lech Lecha? Where are you? Noach. Okay. Not yet in Lech Lecha. So you were in Noach last week, but in terms of our stuff, we're in the middle of the Rashi on chapter 7 of the book of Shemot, verse 19. Okay. Talking about the different bodies of water. Hold on, Elon's joining. Talking about the different bodies of water that God says will be filled with blood. We're still in the predictive mode. It hasn't happened yet. We're saying, Rachel, what's going to happen? As is our wont, let's read the verse to remind us of the full verse, and then we'll jump into the middle of the Rashi. I don't remember who was reading the Rashi that time, but we'll assign someone else. Okay, verse 19, chapter 7. Vayomer Adonai al Moshe. God said to Moshe, Emor el Aharon, speak to Aaron. Tachmarcha, take your staff, singular you. So meaning this is what Moses should say to Aaron. Unetei yadcha, extend your hand. Al meimei Mitzrayim, on the waters. Mayim is a plural sounding word, but it has its own. So when it's put into smichut, it gets that yud at the end. So the waters of Egypt. Al naharotehem, on their naharot, which we'll remind ourselves in a second what Rashi said about them. Al yorehem, on their yoors. Again, I'm going to untranslate it. Al agmehem, on their agams, on their interesting Israeli artists with presentations in Tel Aviv. Anyone? The al kol mikveh memehem, and upon all the gatherings of their water. Right? We discussed that the word mikveh is really the original biblical word for the notion of a gathering of water that became oceans and seas and things like that, which is why to this day the best mikveh is the ocean itself. The yihiyu dam, there will be blood, Daniel Day-Lewis. V'hayadam b'chol eretz Mitzrayim, and blood will be on all of the land of Egypt. Uva eitzim, and even on wood. I added in the even and on stones. Okay, so we dealt with the pshat of that, and Rashi is going to get to the more some of those questions. But we had gotten through the Rashi that described, feeling a little out of sorts here, that had described the Nahar as the Naharot HaMoshchim, rivers that flow.
Can I just correct your translation?
Please.
It's not there will be blood, it's they will become blood. Because it's plural. Vayiyudam, and they will become blood.
Right, correct. All of the waters that have been mentioned will be blood. Terrific, thank you. I appreciate that. Right? They will, so it's not even that they will be filled with, but that they will be blood. Very good. Okay. So Rashi, first we discussed why it's significant that Aaron is being asked to do this plague, because you don't strike the Nile that saved you. The Nahar was described as Naharot HaMoshchot, like our sense of a river, so flowing water. And we were halfway through the Rashi comment on Yorehem. Where we had gotten to was, what's the difference between a Nahar and a Yor? So first Rashi says, Heim brechot unegarim, pools and negarim. Did we look at the Jastro on Nagar? I don't remember. Because it's a kind of an interesting Hebrew word. I want to show that to you. Look on the page. So Nun Gimel Reish is an interesting word. Most, modern non-Hebrew speaking Jews learn that root from camp. Nagarut is woodworking. If you see the first definition of nagar, well, actually the second definition of nagar is to scrape or to saw, which is why nagarut is woodworking. But the first is to carry along or to roll. And it apparently is connected to garar, which means to drag, right? So if you look in the next entry, so the nifal of nigar, it's similar to mashach, and it means to be conducted in gutters, to be stored up. So when Rashi says here that whereas a nahar is its own flowing river. A Yaor are brechot and nigarim, pools and irrigation canals, right? Ha'asuyot bidei adam, that are made by human hands, misfat hanahar lasadot, right? To bring the water from the edge of the actual free-flowing river to the fields. That's where we ended, okay? Any kind of questions on that little wrap-up before we jump in? Okay. Rebecca, would you like to read, so the next word is v'hanilus.
The nilus minav mitbarfim va'oleh derech hayeorim mashke hasadeh.
Okay, translate that.
And the waters of the Nile were increased, and it would rise by way of the streams and would water the fields.
Okay, so Rashi's saying two things, even though it only looks like he's saying one thing. He's telling us something about the Nile. Too bad Tova isn't here to add some more layers to this. By the way, the word Nilus is the Hebrew word for Nile. It's telling us that what is true about the Nile's waters, that they would meet barech. It's a great word that Rashi is choosing, because we normally would understand lihit barech means to be blessed, right? Yitbarach v'yishtabach, etc. But actually, in core biblical Hebrew, the root bet resh chaf, or actually in Rashi's understanding of the word, it doesn't just mean to be blessed; it means to be doubled, to be increased, to overflow, right? So the waters of the Nile overflow, become very abundant, and oled derech yorim, and it rises by means of these man-made irrigation canals, and in that way, mashke hasadot, it irrigates the fields. What's the second thing that Rashi is saying, even though it's not obvious that he's saying? Anyone know? Or why is he saying this here? By what?
Shemitah?
That's not. I don't think it's a Shemitah comment, Diane.
It's not only the waters that are going to be blood, but also all the fields.
Interesting. I hadn't thought about that. That if the blood is also going in the Yorim that are getting to the fields, then it's going to enter into the fields. Good. What else? By what name is the Nile known in biblical Hebrew? Yaor, right? So Rashi's assuming that we remember that, and they're saying, and dear reader, if you're wondering why I've translated Yorehem as a general word for irrigation canals, I'm now explaining why the Nile is called that, because it's basically the biblical word for the Nile is the source of all the irrigation that takes place in Egypt, because that's actually how the Nile operates, right? And I wanted to show you, Rashi says something similar to this back in a different verse in Breshit. Let me share the screen. Okay, so this is way back in the last few chapters of last 10 chapters of Breshit. And to get the context, this is the second verse of Parshat Miketz, right? So if you look on the left side, Vayhi Miketz Nataim Yamim, after 2 years after the scene at the end of the previous parsha, which had the cupbearer story. Ufaro cholem, Pharaoh dreamt a dream. V'hinei omed al Yaor, he was standing on the Yaor. Here it's not the Nilus, it's the Yaor, which we now understand through Rashi as the main source of irrigation of Egypt, by which the natural waters of the Nile would find its way to the fields through man-made canals, right? That's basically what the word Yaor means here. And on the second verse, V'hinei min hayaor olot sheva parot, right? From the Yaor, 7 cows came up, etc. Look at Rashi says on the word al hayaor. Kol sha'ar naharot einam kruim yorim chutz minilus. All other natural rivers that come from God, that come from nature itself, are not called yorim, except for the Nile, right? They're called rivers, right? They're not called yaors. Mipnei shekol haaretz asuyim yorim, because the entire land is kind of rendered into channels of these canals, yorim, bidei adam, through human work. The Nilus, and the Nile, ole betocham, ascends from within them, umashke otam, and sends water through them, irrigates them. Lefi she'ein gshamim yordim b'mitzrayim, because rain is not abundant in Egypt, tadir, and often, kisha'ar aratzot. So Rashi back there said, when we say al hayor, we don't just mean the canal, we mean the river in Egypt that becomes coterminous with the canals that extend from it. Okay, so he says it over there, and he said it in our verse as well. Okay, how are we doing so far? Good. Okay, so let's keep going. Let's see, was there anything else I wanted to show on this? No. Looked at that. Yeah, Barry.
Theologically, you're going to envision the source of the Nile being a higher altitude. The Nile flows out, down, the downward direction. And so all the canals that are attached to it would also be flowing down from that.
Is that true?
Well, the water doesn't flow up.
Water doesn't flow up, but people throughout history have found a way to not just irrigate places that are downhill from water sources. I don't know how, but I know it's happened. I mean, I know how it's done in modern times. I don't know how it was done in ancient times.
There by hand.
Yeah.
That what they did was to make canals that would flow also and would be going that direction.
Yeah. Okay, let's continue with the Rashi because we have one more collection of water that Rashi is going to comment on. Agmehem, Rebecca.
Agmehem, they're pools. Mutzat mayim she'enam no'im ve'em moshkin ela omdim b'makom ha'chafet ve'orim lo. What is it?
Ashton. Ashton. We'll look at that in a second.
Ashton. So a gathering of waters that do not gush.
A socialist collective gathering of waters.
That do not gush and do not flow. They stay in one place, and it is called in Old French Eshton.
Right. What would we call this in English?
Is that a lake or a pond?
Yeah, a lake or a pond or a reservoir, right? Look at the this is Otsar La'azeh Rashi. We've looked at this before. This is a comprehensive collection. It's on the screen of all the old French words that Rashi uses in every one of his comments in the Torah and in the Talmud. And this is entry number 3074, 7th chapter Shemot, verse 19, on the word Agmehem. He spells it Aleph Yud Shin Tet Nun Kuf. According to Otsar La'azeh Rashi, it's the French word eston. Anyone ever heard that word? I don't know enough French to know that.
Eston is a pond.
Yeah?
Yeah.
How's
even
it
nowadays?
How is it spelled in modern French?
Eston.
Without the S, it just with the.
ETANC?
S, you don't say it's. Oh.
So there's like the accent that takes away the S.
Eston.
All right,
And I
so
think it's related to the word tank.
oh,
It's
that's
like
fascinating.
Pond.
A collection of liquid. Fascinating.
No.
Let's see, it may be related to staunch to some, flow.
Don't know, but that's those connections are really interesting. Thank you. So that's what Rashi says, eston. Okay, so a lake, pond, reservoir. So if we go back and consider the whole verse, we've got really a reference to all the ways in which water would appear in the ancient world, right? You have the original flows of water, the Nahar. You have Yorehem, which according to Rashi refers to the Nile and all of its not natural tributaries, but canal tributaries, and the standing water that nothing flows from it, but it collects water. And then Rashi is quiet on the phrase "v'chol mikveh hamayim," all of the collections of water, etc. Okay, anything else on before we look at the next Rashi? Okay, the next Rashi, sometimes we do this in backwards order, but I want to kind of give you the question before we read the Rashi. I'm not sure we raised this when we read the verse 2 weeks ago, that the phrase B'chol Eretz Mitzrayim, you could read as a redundancy, right? Because we seem to have already referenced something comprehensive, that we've got, first, we already had Al Memei Mitzrayim, the waters of Egypt, and then we had the subcategories of the Nahars and the Ors and the Agams, and then we had the comprehensive Kol Mikveh Mehem, all gatherings of water, And then all of a sudden we have B'chol Eretz Mitzrayim, right? Throughout the land of Egypt. So since you could read that phrase as a redundancy, even a redundancy on a redundancy, Rashi is going to be sensitive to it. Barry, and then I see Rick's hand, and then we'll have Rebecca read that Rashi. Can someone open that window? It's getting a little stuffy in here. Thanks. Yes, Barry.
I didn't even say it was invited, but up until now, blood is in the water. But now blood is over the land. All the land. Yeah.
So maybe this goes back to what Diane was, or someone said before, that if it's coming through the source of water and then being brought out to irrigation, it's not just going to hit the water collections, but the actual land itself. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Anything else on that, Rick?
Hi. First of all, that was just Barry, right? It was really kind of muffled. I couldn't exactly hear what he was saying. If you're going to paraphrase after, then fine. But
what Barry was saying is that could make that phrase not redundant is up until now we've spoken about where the blood is going to be, where the water is, and then by extension, it's going to actually reach the entire land because of the irrigation system in Egypt.
Okay. That's great. That's great. I wanted to do a trope thing.
Okay.
Trope Josh. So on Aharon, we have a pazer, which is the rarest of the trope that we usually use. We don't have another one until chapter 10, where it's for the sake of telling your son, telling your kids. And the last one was back when they were asking why are you being so harsh? But anyway, I just wanted to say that the pazer on Aharon really emphasize. I know we already talked about why it was Aaron, but I just wanted to say that the trope went along with that, emphasizing his importance here.
Yes.
Okay.
Great. Okay. Anyone else? Rosemary?
I was thinking, at the beginning, it said that the water is going to be blood. So it's not only Nile. There can be water coming from the source, from well. I mean, once the water is going to be blood, everywhere is blood. So
yeah,
if there is water like in the plantation, it will be red. Everything is red.
Yeah.
I mean, even if it comes under the mountain.
Right. So
it's not only Nile. Nile is more dramatic to see a big river red.
Right.
But every drop of water is red.
So Rashi is going to say something similar and interesting. Barry was focused on the word eretz in this phrase as if it's coming through the water, but even the non-water things are going to be bloodified. Rashi's going to read a little bit more closely the way Rosemary read it. Let's see what he says and see how we respond to it. Rebecca on B'chol Eretz Mitzrayim.
B'chol Eretz Mitzrayim, throughout all the land of Egypt. Off the Merachatzot, Uba Ambataot, Sheba Batim.
Okay, what does that mean?
In the bathhouses and in the baths that were in the house.
Right. So what's Rashi's answer to the question of why this is not a redundancy?
Because it applies to different uses of water.
Right. And I think he's saying somehow it'll even apply to water that had made it into someone's house before the plague began, right? That's not still drawing from it, that poof, that the Nile is going to be bloody. And so obviously all the places where the Nile sends water to in the irrigation, but even in your house, in your own personal ancient Egyptian plumbing, even if you're collecting water from a place that already had gotten its water from regional sources, you're not gonna escape the bloodiness of the water, right? So he's focusing on other collections of water that are not referenced or not collected or referred to in the other words for water. Okay.
Are the later plagues introduced with this much detail?
Some of them are, right. It'll be interesting as we go through the plagues we can compare the intros, right? So I remember the description of the frogs is, it's pretty, I remember because there's a hard versus to lane. It's a lot of individual places that the frogs are going to get to. If you wanted to look ahead just to compare one,
For frog comes nose and frog comes nose.
Nice. Just look quickly at verse 27. So just 10 verses later. And again, we'll do this slowly later on. But if you refuse to send, I'm going to plague all of your borders with frogs. And the river will swarm with frogs. And they'll come up. They'll come into your home. And in your bedrooms. And on your bed. And on your servants' houses. And everywhere. Even in your ovens. Right? So it's, I don't know if we could do a word-for-word comparison, but there is a descriptive, frightening, foreboding explanation of all the places the frogs are going to end up once the frogs come. Yeah. Diane.
So,
Can Zoomers hear Diane? Are Zoomers here?
can you hear me?
You can't? I try to speak a little louder.
Okay, this is a question.
You can't really hear anyone commenting very much. It's very, very low.
Hmm.
Do you want me to come?
My microphone?
Is that where they're, no, aren't they getting it from the room somehow?
I don't remember.
Yeah.
Diane, speak.
Okay, testing.
Yeah, it's very low. All right, we're gonna have to try to. So speak as
Project a little bit.
Okay, I'm projecting. This is a question, and that is Kol Eretz Mitzrayim does not count Goshen? Is Goshen not considered part of Mitzrayim?
in terms of where the Israelites are.
Yeah,
Yeah. What do you think?
well, it would seem that Goshen is not part of Eretz Mitzrayim, which is a little odd.
And because what you're asking is how would this not impact the Israelites?
I mean, theoretically, it didn't, right?
Right.
Well, it was true with darkness because there was light in Goshen.
Right. So in some of the plagues, it says explicitly that the Israelites did not suffer from them, and some it's either implied that they did or implied that they didn't. Right. So you could actually read the opposite. You could read B'chol Eretz Mitzrayim to include all of its satellite places, including Goshen. As you'll see, we'll end the plague of blood without any direct reference to whether or not the Israelites experienced it. In our kind of colloquial retelling of the story, we believe that the Israelites were spared it, but it doesn't say it explicitly in the text. Yeah.
I'm gonna
Joe?
channel Tova, because I
Okay.
asked her this, I had the same question last week, and I asked her, is Goshen on the Nile? And she said, yes, it's on the Delta.
Uh-huh.
Yes.
I see Rick's hand and then Barry.
Hi. I didn't plan this. I just see it. But the trope again, the midpoint, the etnachta is on this v'yiyudam, right? So that you could call it the high point, although the pazer was a high point, but that's a clause, right? And they will be blood. The next phrase from v'haya to the end, I'd like to suggest maybe it's not talking about water anymore. It's talking about blood, v'hayadam, in the land, and uva eitzim, the trees, and avanim is the stone. So it's like the leprosy plague where it gets into the building and the house and stuff. So I don't know if anybody ever talked about it in the commentary, but maybe it's not talking about water here. It's talking about the land and the trees and the stones, that they'll be affected by the blood. That's
Yes. So what we're reading through is that there are really two ways of understanding the second half of this verse, or the last third of the verse, right? That the whole Eretz Mitzrayim uva eitzim uva avanim refers either to other places where water is stored, which is how Rashi is going to read it, or after we get to the Yudama the etnachta, right? We're understanding that since blood's in the water, it will then also get to all other places, including places that are not of water, but are places where water has been brought to by the natural use of it, right? And those are two different ways of understanding the verse. And of course, we don't have a record of what happened aside from this one, so we have to we have to remain shrouded in a machloket about it. I see Barry's hand and then Rosemary.
So going back again to geology, the rivers flow down from the source. This is not a geological natural thing where the source of the Nile turned red. Eventually, everything turned red where the water flows to. But any place where there is water, like in bathtubs, on trees, on stones, this blood is all over the place.
Yeah.
That's a miracle of the issue.
Yeah. Rosemary?
Well, I think the importance of this plague is the most from the other plagues, because this is from economy part, survivor part, whereas the frog, you can put astronaut costume and you can save yourself from frog for some days, or the locust just eats the grass, the plant, the plantation, but it doesn't bother. I mean, it's scary, but it's not, but this is survivor. If you don't have water 1 week, it's doomed, and it's not doomed for the week, it's doomed for the year, because the crop will die. And when they say on the stones and the trees, in the morning, there are many places which they don't have enough water, they have dew, so they collect the dew. And God even made that blood, so you can collect and drink it. So if they say tree, it's not the tree becomes red, but the dew on the tree leaves are becoming red.
And we discussed last time, I think, that there's some instinct to read the plagues as constantly growing in a crescendo, because clearly the last one is the biggest blow. But there's also a way of reading the plagues as beginning with a rather comprehensive blow to the society, with a dip in the middle, not to downplay what it's like if you are overcome by locusts, but that it's not necessarily only going up in magnitude, but it might have begun with the most comprehensive hit on society and then ended with something that's parallel to it, right? Particularly since blood, right? Like it begins with blood and ends with bloodshed. And that's an English pun or English association with words, and we don't understand that the Makat Bechorot, the plague of the firstborn, was bloody, right? Certainly the way it's represented in media, they just died, they weren't slaughtered. But there's blood the night of the 10 plagues on the doorpost, right? So there is a chiastic structure to beginning with the blood and a bloody plague that could in and of itself be considered the worst thing you could do to society, and then it ends with the one that finally that changes Pharaoh's mind before he changes it again one more time. Larry, and then Ronan, and then we'll read the next Rashi.
Can we read the next Rashi first and then go to me?
Yeah, Ronan, what do you want to do?
No, just saying in terms of water, just I'm focusing on the water side of it, not the blood side of it, that there is a definite theme of water throughout this entire story. I mean, obviously you can look at the first plague and the last plague, or you can look at the first plague and the last thing that happened before they leave Egypt is the splitting of the sea. And it all has to do with control. Which is notoriously one of basically the hardest thing to control for mankind forever, right? I mean, if you've ever built a house or renovated a house,
Build a road.
Water is the thing that screws everything up, right? If you don't control the water, you don't have a project. And that's the whole idea of Egypt. That's why Egypt was so successful, because they thought they knew how to water. But really only God can control the water, right? And that's really shown in the beginning of that. Not the end, but the end of the Egypt story.
No, that's wonderful, because there are many places you can claim as the end to this narrative. It could be Exodus night. It could be split across the Red Sea. It could be Mount Sinai, right? So if you put the end point as the moment that they're finally free of Pharaoh, you're right. They end by having been saved through water. Once again, he is plagued by water, just as the plagues began with the water being plagued. And I think your comment also awakens why it's significant that the word mikveh mehem appears in the verse, because mikveh hamayim refers to God's primordial controlling of the waters, right? The one who was able to suck shamayim into collections, right? Only God can do that. We can do facsimiles of it. What the ancient Egyptians did was a pretty impressive facsimile of it, but ultimately we are parroting God's macro version of that. God is always in control, which is one of the Torah's messages. Okay. Stevie?
Yeah, just pointing out in the difference between the first half of the verse, second half of the verse, that when we say the beginning, etc.,
right? The implication is like Aaron would have to take his staff over every single, like, either every single body of water or every single type of body of water, right? Right. Aaron is instructed to put his staff over the Nile and also over the canals and also over something else, right? It's kind of bizarre to then imagine that the outcome of that would be that, right, and each, like, it's like implicitly, like Hudam, right, could be like, and each one, right, will become bloody, but then then the second half sort of shifts it and say like, no, blood will be everywhere. Like you do this once, maybe, and it's saying, and you're right, blood will be everywhere. It does seem to be a conclusion that that adjusts the meaning of the verse.
Yeah, and I keep thinking about what Joel said before about the vihiyudam v'hayadam, right? So the vihiyudam right before on the etnachta, at the fulcrum of the verse, seems to go backwards to suggest all the things that were mentioned will be plural blood, and then the Torah still seems to feel the obligation to say, and in addition to that, blood will be in all these places as well. So is what we're learning in the second half of the verse a mirroring or an extension of what we learned in the first half of the verse? And again, we'll never be able to resolve that. Let's read the last Rashi in the verse, then we'll hear what Larry has to say. The last two Rashis in the verse. The last Rashi, Uba Eitzim Vabanim. Right. So that Rashi, before we've been translated, is saying, lest you think that what's referring to here is that the wood and the stones themselves, because the notion that if there's blood in the water, there's blood in the fields, and there's actually going to be blood in your utensils, lest you think it means that. No, rather it means that
water that was in vessels of wood and in vessels of stone.
Right. And if you remember the Onkelos, so Rashi either just happens to agree with Onkelos or is impacted by Onkelos. Onkelos translated Eitzim and Avanim, which just means wood or woods and stones, to Manei A'a u'Manei Avna, utensils of these things, right? I don't remember if it's 10 Commandments or the Prince of Egypt or some other representation. There's definitely like a scene where families like have water in a cup or something, and then the plague hits, and the water in the cup that's already there turns into blood, right? Mm-hmm. And it's almost like a cinematic scene that is averring Rashi's comment. It's not just that from this point forward, any water that's drawn from the Nile become blood, but the water that's already there, blood. Even in the water that has already been collected in your wooden pot or your stone cup. Okay, Larry.
So first of all, before I get to this particular Rashi, I want to go back to the beginning because I think we tend to forget. This doesn't happen. This isn't happening. What's happening is Moses is telling Aaron. So he doesn't only tell him to hold his hand over, he tells him what the consequences would be as if Aaron's going to do it. Aaron's got to have in mind all these different things in order for this to actually be happening. And that goes back to what Barry was saying, is no, this isn't that there's going to be some phenomenon at the headwaters that are going to flow down. This is something that's going to happen to all the waters wherever they are. And we all gone over all the waters wherever they are. The very last two words, uva eitzim, uva avanim, is reminiscent of eitz and Evan. And eitz and Evan are not only vessels, but they're also idols. So go to Devarim. So go to Devarim chapter 4, verse 28.
Let me pull it up because not everyone has a full Tanakh in front of them. 1 second. What's the verse again? Devarim.
Sham.
28 what?
Chapter 4, verse 28.
Chapter 28, verse 4?
No. Chapter 4, verse 28.
Who's on first? All right, let me share the screen. 1 second. It's there. Okay, Baba Temshan Elohim.
Elohim, Maaseh Yedei Adam, Eitz ve'Evan. And I'm reminded also of twice we have, well, once in Psalms and then twice in Psalms. We have, sorry, just flew out of my mind. Atzabehem kesef v'zahav maseh yedei adam.
Right.
I'm not sure if Atzabehem also comes from eitz, because it's atzav, which is idol, but eitz. So one interpretation, which I'm going to kind of alter for kind of suggesting it, but not suggesting the way that I'm suggesting it exactly, is that, and even their idols, even though I don't know if they have idols, even their idols will have this blood coming out of them.
Yeah. Who knows if that was intended?
No,
but it's very evocative, because you're right. Eitz va'even appears many times in biblical literature as like a kind of a comprehensive merism suggesting all the things that they would worship.
Right.
Yeah. We have it in one of the Psalms of Hallel, right?
True. Well, one Psalm in Hallel, but also on Shabbat morning in the Nishmat. No, it's before it's before the Great Hallel. The Psalm we say before the Great Hallel has before we.
Also in Vayachnan, just a few chapters after that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Diane, Renee.
So I'm thinking about this literarily. So blood is a sustainer of life, right? Without the blood flow inside of us, which surely was known to people for a long time, we wouldn't have life. And so God is taking this sort of sustaining power and turning it into a destructive power. It's really interesting.
Yeah, as Rona pointed out, as with the splitting of the Red Sea, right? Where it's not just taking a sustaining power and turning it into destructive power, it's turning a birth moment for one into a death moment for everyone else, right? As we discussed, without getting too graphic, the Israelites emerging from the Red Sea is definitely a birth canal image, right? And coming into life, having passed through that channel. Renee.
So I just wanted to mention that Everett Fox agrees with Larry, because Everett Fox also says that everywhere in the Bible that has wood and stone, where it occurs as a pair in the singular refers to idols.
Right. So in our verse in Shemot, it's in the plural. That doesn't mean that it's not hinting at that on some level. Great. Okay. I think anything else in that verse before we go to, is your hand up, Rosemary?
Yeah, I'm just thinking that I learned about the blood in matzah much later in my life, but I always think it comes from here also, because people with the blood being over the houses.
You mean the blood libel? You mean that Jews would make matzah with the blood of,
That was misunderstanding of having the blood over the door spot.
Right.
And the firstborns dying.
Yeah.
And then the blood in Nile. This to give idea to anti-Semites to create something that people will believe.
Yeah. We in our family do that very rarely.
The blood in matzah.
The blood of Gentile children. It's an infrequent ritual. It's only on special occasions. Okay, gallows humor. Let's go to the next verse. Shkayach. Verse 20. Oh, so Rashi is going to be quiet for a few verses on 20 and 21. Doesn't mean that we have to be. Rachel, do you want to read verse 20? And project. Yeah, good.
And Moshe ve'Aharon ka'asher Siva Adonai ve'Aram v'Matei ve'Yadeh et Hamayim asher v'Yaor le'enem Paro Ul Enem Avadim what? Avadah, thank you. Ve'yah hu kol hamayim asher vayachor ladam.
Good. You instinctively corrected yourself from Pharaoh to Paro because we know the name is Paro. It actually is Pharaoh here because of what rule?
In the
Right. But and why? Where are my grammar nerds? Why is there no dot in the Fe? Because the Yud of the Einay before it is one of the four letters of Ahoy, and Fe is a Beged Kefet letter, and they're in Munach Katon, which means they're in a conjunctive trup. So the Yud takes the dot away from the Pe. So it's in a Pharaoh, not Paro. Okay. See if you can translate that or render or translate.
translation.
We'll start there.
Moses and Aharon did just as the Lord commanded. He lifted up the rod. Let's say that's Aharon.
Right, because what was commanded is that Moshe tell Aaron to do it. So if they did what was commanded, they did it all the way through.
He lifted up the rod and struck the water in the Nile in the sight of Pharaoh and his fortunes, and all the water in the Nile turned to blood. And what I want to check out is, did it say strike or did it say hold your arm over? Because they're not the same.
Yeah. Well, there are several not the sames in this verse and the previous verse, as Larry pointed out a little bit. We have in verse 19 that the instruction is the verbs are kach and nete, take and extend. We have in our verse a yach, a smite, which is really the first time I think that I'm noticing this, and this either means something or nothing. That later on, when Moshe is asked to do A with a staff and does B, he gets punished for it. Here, Aaron is being asked to do A. He seems to do B, and it seems to be okay. And as Larry pointed out before, maybe Stevie also did, that in verse 19, the instruction seems to be that there are several moments where there's going to be a raising of the rod and a striking, and how time-consuming that must have been to go to every single pond. When it actually happens, it seems he does it once, and that spreads the plague outward, right? By Yarem, B'mateh, he lifted up his with his staff, Vayach et hamayim asher b'yaor, struck the water that was in the river, the Nile, and then everything becomes bloody. Barry and then Larry. Larry.
I was going to just address what you just said. Moshe strikes the rock, and he was just told to speak to it. And here, Aaron was told, just raise your arm over, and he strikes.
Yeah. Yes.
And he's not punished the same way Moshe was punished.
Right.
Yeah.
Larry, Rona.
I'm going meta again. Go back to verse 14.
Okay.
That's the instruction that God gives to Moses. Go see Pharaoh down at the edge of the water, right? And talk to him and tell him.
15.
15 says to tell him, and 16 says to tell him that Adonai sent him, right? All that. And then 17 said, and then 17, he's telling him what God said, what Adonai said, and then 18 that there's the blood and the fish, and then in 19 God's still talking to Moses, and then tell Aaron. Then full stop. Then we get to V'yasu, right? V'yasu chen, and did thusly who? Moses and Aaron. Moses did from verse 14 to verse 18. He did all those things. We don't see this, but he went down to talk to Pharaoh and tell him all those things. And what did Aaron do? Well, Aaron is the only thing that's actually described in this verse. None of what Moses did is described. I don't have any comments about the differences and all that, but that's my understanding of how this, someone I'm sure has done a diagram of where all the different instructions and how far back they go and where they stop and punctuated it. Some of the translations are actually punctuated with quotes and small quotes and all sorts of other things. But
Isn't that going to be your dissertation for your doctorate in Bible, Larry? I'll read that. I'll read that for $1. Rona and then Rick.
I mean, God doesn't talk directly to God talks to Moshe.
Mostly.
Well, in this case.
In this case, correct.
So Aaron is like interpreting Whereas Moshe is almost always talked to directly by God. So, I mean, I guess he's interpreting too. He's not playing a game of telephone.
Right.
So maybe Aaron is like, just has a different standing with God, and that's why he doesn't get punished for doing it slightly wrong. I don't know.
Or maybe it was a telephone game. By the time it got from God's mouth to Moshe's mouth and Moshe's mouth to Aaron's mouth, that it changed. This is going to, from some sort of the miniature to the macro. I'm sure I've referenced before in this class many times the great Professor David Weiss Halivni, whose yahrzeit was just, first yahrzeit was just a few days ago. He was really, until last year, the greatest living Talmudist. He taught at the seminary. He left the seminary to teach at Columbia. He was one of these people who literally knew the Talmud by heart, the stories about the pin test when he was 12 or 13 years old in Romania, and he would make a couple of kopecks by going to the local yeshiva, and he would say, like, if a pin is piercing Masechet Bava Metzia, what word is it piercing on page 32a? And he would know the word, right? He died about a year ago. He was known mostly as a Talmudist, but he was also a rather, from where he came from, radical theologian, because he came from the yeshiva world. He grew up in the same town as Elie Wiesel. He and Elie Wiesel were the best of friends in Siget, Romania. He lived at a time when rabbinic ordination was not a 5-year professional degree after your BA, but just passing exams. So he was a 13-year-old ordained rabbi in Auschwitz. He has 2 major books in English. His most renowned work, which is impenetrable even to people who know Talmud really well, is Mekorot to Mesorot, where his method of studying Talmud from a source critical method. But his primary 2 books in English were his autobiography, The Book and the Sword, which is an easy read in the sense you can get through it in a couple of hours. It's an overwhelming read to hear his story, but I commend it to all of you, The Book and the Sword. And his book on theology, also rather short, called Revelation Restored, where he tries to, I don't know how to cohere an academic study of Judaism with an Eastern European Hasidic love of Torah. He's not willing to surrender the notion of God doing revelation at Sinai, but he knows too much about the intellectual academic world to know that it's hard to really make sense of all the errors and the mistakes and the whatever's in the text without some kind of understanding of human involvement. So his solution, al regel achat, is to say, and this is what connects to what Rona said, there was a pristine revelation from God, but the moment it came from God and was put into human hands, it got instantly muddied and changed and rendered differently because of our fallibilities, not God's. There's an infallible God and there was an infallible word, but kind of like, this is my analogy, not his, like blood is a certain color in the body, but as soon as it's exposed to air, it's instantly a different color. So as soon as God's word was exposed to humanity, we perverted it unintentionally. And therefore we have a text which is muddled, but the original revelation was pure, revelation restored. So it could be that God said A to Moshe, and by the time Moshe said it to Aaron, because we're flawed, imperfect people, we don't remember things, it was already somewhat different. So maybe Aaron wasn't not doing what he was told to do, he's just doing like Moshe remembered or transmitted it differently.
What's the name of the person?
Rabbi David Weiss Halivni. His name in Europe was Weiss, but when he moved to, I think he first came to Israel and then to the States, he did not want the name by which he was known to teach Torah to be Germanic because he hated the Germans. So Weiss is white, so he changed white to Halivni, the white one. David Weiss Halivni. He talks about this in the Book of the Sword. He would do these tricks in the yeshiva where he would say, like, give me, like, they would say, what is the 100th statement of the sage Rava and tractate Sanhedrin? And if you can get it right, the next 10 seconds, we'll give you a kopek. And he would get it right. That's how he would make extra little money for his family before going to the war. Yes.
Yeah, I want to go back to the discussion we're having on the hitting the stone.
Good. A little bit louder, Barry. And then Rick, I see your hand.
I want to go back to the discussion we're having, the hitting the stone and hitting the water. Moshe's attitude, it was an attitude different than here in the river. And yet again, Aaron was just doing his approach. he had directly threatened this from God. Moshe was angry at the people at that time. And so in addition to his command to speak to make order, he was expressing his anger, emotion. And for this, he was not allowed to be the leader.
Which is different than in this. Yeah. Just while I'm there, I can't mention Rabbi Halivni's name without passing along my two favorite stories from him. He spoke with a gentle, sweet, thick Eastern European accent. He spoke knew English perfectly, but he spoke with a thick accent. So when my friend Rabbi David Wise was visiting JTS to apply to rabbinical school, his name was Wise, W-I-S-E, he would daven. He went to spend Shabbat davening at the minyan that Rabbi Halivni was the rabbi of. That's its own story. It was Rabbi Halivni's teacher was Professor Louis Finkelstein, who was the chancellor of the seminary in the 50s, 60s, 70s. Professor Finkelstein had Parkinson's late in his life, and a minyan of people gathered in his home. And basically, the last decade of his life, there's a group of people who daven every Shabbat morning in his apartment. I would daven there a few times in the early years of college. Then Professor Finkelstein died. You had a group of people who had been davening with each other for years. They decided to found a minyan. It's one of the first independent minyanim in Manhattan, called Kehilat Orach Eliezer, KOE, the congregation of the guests of Eliezer. Eliezer was Professor Finkelstein's Hebrew name. And so I would daven Moshe Shabbat mornings at that minyan, which met and still meets to this day in a nursing home on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. So David Wise was visiting, and he was introduced to Rabbi Halivni, who was this eminent scholar. And Rabbi Halivni says, Rabbi Wise Halivni says, "What's your name?" And David said, "My name is David." "What's your last name?" "Oh, it's David Wise." "David Wise? That's so funny. That's my name too." Such a sweet thing to hear from the world's greatest living Talmudist. And another time we were davening, and the person laning clearly noticed something amiss in the text and beckoned Rabbi Halivni over, and he looked at it, and whatever he saw, it was enough for that Torah. That Torah needed to be replaced. So they rolled it up. It was the middle of an aliyah. They brought it back to storage, and then they were going to get another Torah from storage to bring back in. And while that was happening, we were all milling around. And one of my friends who is in that stage in the life where the only thing that's fun to do is to ask your rabbi a question to make it clear that you're very conscientious about things, even if it's obvious. So Lou goes over to Rabbi Halivni and says, "Rabbi Halivni, was there a mistake in the Torah?" Rabbi Halivni says, "A mistake in the Torah? How could there be a mistake in the Torah? The Torah is perfect, but it was a mistake in the Sefer Torah." So he had this sweet, cute, impish demeanor and knew all of rabbinic literature by heart. And his yortzeit was this week, so it's nice to bring him back to life a bit. Okay, Rick and Renee.
I got to follow those stories.
You do.
Oh,
That's why I did it, just to make you uncomfortable, just to put the pressure on.
Success. So again, the trope, I didn't plan this, but it adds drama to it.
But God did.
Yes. Okay, so the Mapach Pashta, normally you don't repeat it. It's kind of rare that you have Mapach Pashta and then you have it again. So Vayarem Bamate, so he's lifting up, right, the rod, and in that moment everybody's looking at the rod. What is he going to do with it? And then Vayach Etamaim, he hits the water in the second motion. That's number one. Number two, the Einei Pharaoh and the Einei Avadav, it reminds me of what we just heard with the grasshoppers with the spies, that they weren't really grasshoppers, but in their eyes and in the enemy's eyes, we're like grasshoppers. It was all mental in their head. So I don't know exactly what to do with it, but it's like there's lots of different ways to describe what's going on, but to say that it happened in the eyes of Pharaoh and in the eyes of the servants, I just think there's something there. And the last one, Vayehafchu, reminds me of Purim, where everything is upside down and not the way it's supposed to be. So, and that has a tevir on it just to make it stand out. But I thought I'd throw that in.
Thank you, Rick. Thank you. Renee.
I just thought it's interesting that the word for hitting is makah that we use in regular Hebrew, and also that becomes the word for the plagues, makah, as well.
Correct. Right. That word vayach is truncated when a 3-letter root whose last letter is hey is put into a vav hayipuch. The hey drops out, and you get these oddly truncated words like vayefk, he cried. The root is bacha, but the hey just disappears. So the root of vayach is either yud kaf hey or mem kaf hey, depending on how you look at it, and it means to smite or to smack. And you're right, it becomes the word by which this whole topic is known, eser makot, the 10 smackings or smitings or plagues. We translate as 10 plagues. Plague is not really a great translation of the Hebrew word makah, but we have a knowledge of our tradition that exists in English of its own accord, not just as a translation of the Hebrew, just, we live in English. So we have the phrase, the 10 plagues, even though it's not a great word for word translation. Joel, is your hand up?
Yeah, I want to play devil's advocate. I want to play defense attorney for Aaron. So
Okay.
Assuming this is Aaron's charging document, and they say, why should he not be charged the same way that Moshe was charged for hitting the rock? I would say that you could read it as Vayarim Hamateh, he raised his staff, Vayach, and God struck the water. Now, it's not the best translation, but it's reasonable doubt.
Yeah, reasonable doubt. Great. I'll add that into the panoply of potential translations. All right, let's just read verse 21. There's no Rashi on it anyway, but I'm sure we won't finish talking about it today. Elon, do you want to read verse 21?
Sure. V'hadaga asher bayaor meta v'yivash hayaor v'lo yachlu Mitzrayim lishtot mayim min hayaor v'yihi hadam b'chol eretz Mitzrayim.
Okay, and again, as soon as he translates, we're gonna compare what happened to what God predicted would happen. Okay.
And the fish that was in the Nile died. Vayivash, I don't know what that is.
Smell or stink. We had that in God's prediction back in verse 18.
And the Nile stunk. And the Egyptians were not able to drink the water from the Nile. And the blood was all over the land of Egypt.
Good. Great. So if you look at that last phrase, and we assume the phrase Vayihidam b'chol eretz Mitzrayim is a mirror of the second half of 2 verses ago, Vayihayadam b'chol eretz Mitzrayim, that seems to be a comprehensive phrase, right? That like the blood is everywhere. And in our verse 21, it doesn't need to say that it was in the Yor and in the Yagam and in the Nahar and in the Evan and in the Eitz, as if that phrase mentions all of it, which calls into question why in 2 verses above, it has that phrase, plus it mentions all the individual places, right? That's the first thing I wanted to point out. I see a couple of hands, Barry, and then Stevie, and then we'll end.
Well, we have a mixing of a sequence. The water had already turned to blood, but now the dying fish polluting the water, so they can't drink the water. But the water was already blood.
Yeah, right. You're saying you could have put V'lo yachlu Mitzrayim lishtot mayim after the end of the previous verse, where there was blood, they couldn't drink, and in addition to that, the fish stank up the water.
There is no water left in it, all blood.
Yeah. Right. So when it says that the Egyptians could not drink water from the Nile, you could say of course they couldn't drink water because there is no water, or it's a way of saying all the water that had been in the Nile is now unpotable. Okay. Let's pause there. When we get next week, we'll start by going deeper into that verse, and then Rashi pipes up in the next verse.
You have been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am Los Angeles, go to tbala.org.